The afternoon sun was doing that thing it does in late spring, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor of her apartment. He stood near the window, pretending to look at the street below, but really just trying to figure out what he was doing there. 3 months they'd been friends. 3 months of coffee shop conversations, late-night texts, and those weird moments when their eyes would meet for just a second too long before one of them looked away. Today felt different, though. She'd invited him over to help her move some furniture, which seemed innocent enough. But when he arrived, everything was already in place. The bookshelf stood perfectly against the wall, the couch sat exactly where it should, and there wasn't a single box in sight. She'd smiled at his confused expression and said something about finishing earlier than expected. Then she'd offered him tea. Now here they were, in her bedroom, because she wanted to show him the new reading corner she'd created. A small armchair sat by the window with a stack of books beside it. The afternoon light made everything look softer, warmer. He could smell her perfume mixed with the faint scent of lavender from somewhere in the room. It was the kind of moment that felt suspended in time, like the whole world had slowed down just for them. She was talking about the book she'd been reading lately, something about a novel that made her think differently about relationships. He was listening, sort of, but mostly he was watching the way she moved around the small space, how she touched the spine of each book as she mentioned it, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she got excited about a particular story, how she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. The truth was, he'd been thinking about her a lot lately, more than he probably should for someone who was supposed to be just a friend. It started small, like noticing when she wore a new dress or remembering the way she laughed at his terrible jokes. But somewhere along the way it had grown into something bigger, something that made his chest feel tight when she texted him good morning, something that made him replay their conversations in his head before falling asleep. But he was scared. Not of her exactly, but of what might happen if he said something. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if it ruined everything they'd built together? What if their easy friendship turned awkward and strange? He'd seen it happen to other people, friends who tried to become something more and ended up losing everything they had. So he'd been careful, keeping his distance when she stood too close, changing the subject when conversations got too personal, building walls that felt safe, but also felt like they were slowly suffocating him. He told himself it was better this way. That friendship was enough, that he should be grateful for what they had instead of wanting more. She finished talking about the books and turned to face him fully. The late afternoon light was behind her now, making her seem almost glowing. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, something that made his heart start beating faster even though nothing had really happened yet. The room felt smaller suddenly, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him very aware of every breath, every small sound. The distant hum of traffic outside, the soft tick of a clock somewhere in the apartment, the way she was looking at him like she was trying to figure something out. He realized he'd been holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. His hands felt restless, so he shoved them into his pockets. She took a small step closer and he found himself frozen in place. Not because he wanted to run, but because something about this moment felt important. Like they were standing at the edge of something that could change everything. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. He watched her take a deep breath, the kind people take before jumping into cold water or walking into a job interview. The kind of breath that comes before doing something brave. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt full of possibility, full of all the things they'd been too scared to say to each other over the past 3 months. All the almost moments and almosts that had been building up to this. He could see her gathering courage, could practically feel the energy in the room shifting. Something was about to happen, something that would either bring them closer together or create a distance between them that might be impossible to cross. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, to take control of the situation somehow, but his voice felt stuck in his throat. Instead, he just stood there watching her face change as she made some internal decision, watching her shoulders straighten and her chin lift slightly. watching her transform from someone who was uncertain into someone who had decided to be brave, regardless of the consequences. The golden afternoon light continued to stream through the window, painting everything in warm tones. And in that light, in that small room filled with books and possibility, they stood looking at each other like two people who were about to step across a line they'd been dancing around for months. The words came out softer than he expected, almost like she was asking herself the question as much as she was asking him. "If I sit on your bed, will you stop me?" Time seemed to freeze completely. He felt his breath catch somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to take back. She was standing about 3 feet away from him now, close enough that he could see the tiny flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Close enough to notice that her hands were trembling just slightly. His brain went completely blank, not the kind of blank where you forget what you were going to say, but the kind where every thought crashes into each other at once. Did she really just ask that? Was this actually happening? What did she mean exactly? What was the right answer? What did she want him to say? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was like his voice had simply decided to abandon him right when he needed it most. She was still looking at him, waiting for some kind of response, and he could see something flickering in her expression. Hope, maybe, mixed with fear. The same fear he'd been carrying around for months. The bed she was talking about sat right there behind her, made neatly with white sheets and a blue blanket folded at the foot. It looked so normal, so innocent. Just a piece of furniture in a room, but somehow her question had transformed it into something else entirely, something that represented every conversation they'd never had, every feeling they'd never acknowledged, every moment when they'd both wondered what if. His heart was beating so loud, he was sure she could hear it. The sound seemed to fill the entire room, drowning out everything else. He tried to think logically, tried to analyze what she was really asking, but logic had apparently left the building along with his ability to speak. All he could do was stand there frozen, while his mind raced in circles. She took a small step closer and he noticed she was biting her lower lip, something she always did when she was nervous. He'd seen her do it before presentations at work, before trying new restaurants, before any situation that made her anxious. But this felt different. This wasn't just nerves about something unknown. This was nerves about something that could change everything between them. "I mean," she continued, her voice still quiet but steadier now, "we've been dancing around this for months, haven't we? All those late-night conversations where we almost said something but didn't. All those times when we were sitting close and I wondered what would happen if I just—" She trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging unfinished. He knew exactly what she meant. Those moments had been driving him crazy too. Like last week when they'd fallen asleep on her couch watching movies, and he'd woken up with her head on his shoulder, or the time they'd gotten caught in the rain and had to stand close together under a small umbrella, both pretending the situation was completely normal while their hearts raced. Or just 2 days ago when she'd reached across him to grab something, and their faces had ended up inches apart for what felt like forever. The afternoon light had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the floor. But her face was still illuminated, still showing every emotion that was playing across her features. Uncertainty, hope, determination, and something else he couldn't quite name. Something that looked like she'd already made up her mind about what she was going to do regardless of his answer. He tried to take a step back but found himself already against the window. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from this moment that felt too big and too important. His palms were sweating and he wiped them on his jeans, hoping she wouldn't notice how nervous he was. "You don't have to answer," she said, reading his struggle. "Maybe that's not fair of me to ask. Maybe I should have just—" She paused, looking down at her feet for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "But I realized today that I'm tired of wondering. I'm tired of all these almosts and maybes. I'm tired of being scared of losing something that might not even exist." Her honesty hit him like a physical thing. Here she was, putting everything on the line, while he couldn't even manage to form a single word. She was being braver than he'd ever been, asking the question he'd been too afraid to even think about properly. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt different, charged with possibility but also with the weight of his inability to respond. He could see her starting to interpret his silence, could see the hope in her eyes beginning to flicker with doubt. He wanted to tell her that he thought about her, every day, that he'd been carrying around feelings for her that felt too big for his chest, that every time she smiled at him, it felt like the sun coming out, that he was only frozen because this moment meant everything to him, not because it meant nothing, but the words still wouldn't come. She waited for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. 30 seconds of him standing there like a statue, his mouth slightly open as if words were going to come out but never did. 30 seconds of her watching his face cycle through confusion, panic, want, and fear all at once. 30 seconds that felt long enough for her to change her mind a dozen times. But instead of changing her mind, something shifted in her expression. The uncertainty melted away, replaced by something that looked like quiet determination. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face like she was reading a book written in a language she was just learning to understand. "Okay," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I think I understand." He felt a flash of panic. What did she understand? That he didn't want this? That he was rejecting her? He tried to shake his head, tried to signal that she was wrong, but his body still wasn't cooperating. He was trapped in his own paralysis, watching everything unfold like he was seeing it happen to someone else. She took another step forward. Now she was close enough that he could see the tiny scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike as a kid. Close enough to count her eyelashes if he wanted to. Close enough that her perfume mixed with the late afternoon air and created something that made his head feel light. "You're not saying no," she observed quietly, almost like she was working through a puzzle out loud. "But you're not saying yes either. You're just frozen." She paused, and a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I know that feeling. I've been frozen for 3 months. He wanted to nod, wanted to tell her she was exactly right, but he was still locked in place. She seemed to understand anyway. "The thing is," she continued, taking one more small step, "I decided today that I'm done being frozen. I'm done waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect words or for someone else to be brave first." She was so close now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "So I'm going to move, and you can stop me if you want to, or you can just let me." The way she said it wasn't demanding or pushy. It was gentle, like she was giving him permission to stay exactly where he was, while she took responsibility for what happened next. Like she understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone who's overwhelmed is to make the decision for both of you. She turned slightly toward the bed, and he followed her movement with his eyes. The afternoon light was streaming across the white sheets, making them look soft and inviting. Not in a way that felt dangerous or inappropriate, just in a way that felt like comfort. Like a place where two people could sit and finally have the conversation they'd been avoiding. When she looked back at him, there was something peaceful in her face. Like she'd been carrying around a heavy weight and had finally decided to put it down. "I'm going to sit down now," she said, and it wasn't really a question anymore. It was just information, delivered in the same tone she might use to say she was going to make tea or check the mail. He watched her move with what felt like slow-motion clarity. Every step was deliberate but not dramatic. She wasn't rushing or being theatrical about it. She was just walking the few feet to her bed like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like this was always where the afternoon had been heading. She sat down on the edge of the mattress, her feet still touching the floor, her hands folded in her lap. The bed made a small creaking sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. She looked up at him from where she sat, and somehow the change in their heights made everything feel different. More intimate, but also more real. "There," she said simply. "I did it." She seemed almost surprised by her own boldness, like she couldn't quite believe she'd actually followed through. But there was satisfaction in her voice too. Relief, maybe. The relief of finally doing something instead of just thinking about doing it. He was still standing by the window, still frozen, but something inside him was starting to shift. Watching her be so brave, so direct, so completely herself, was like watching someone jump into a cold lake. Part of him wanted to stay, safely on the shore, but a bigger part of him was starting to remember what it felt like to want to swim. She wasn't looking at him expectantly anymore. She wasn't waiting for him to respond or react or do anything at all. She was just sitting there, present and calm, like she'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Like his response, whatever it might be, was secondary to the simple fact that she'd stopped being afraid. The light continued to move across the room as the sun shifted lower in the sky. Soon it would be evening, then night, then tomorrow. But right now, in this moment, she had done exactly what she'd said she would do. She had stopped being frozen. She had moved. And somehow, watching her move was starting to thaw something inside him that had been stuck for months. Something inside him finally broke free. Not broke like something damaged, but broke like ice cracking on a frozen lake when spring finally arrives. He could feel it happening, that shift from being completely stuck to suddenly being able to move again. It started in his chest and spread outward like warmth returning to cold hands. He took a step away from the window. Just one step, but it felt enormous after being frozen for so long. She looked up at him from where she sat on the edge of the bed, and he could see a flicker of surprise cross her face. Maybe she had expected him to stay paralyzed forever. Maybe she had been prepared to sit there alone, having made her brave, gesture to an empty room. He started, then stopped. His voice came out rougher than usual, like he hadn't used it in years instead of just minutes. He cleared his throat and tried again. I've been thinking about you. About this. About us. The words felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd only ever read in books. She didn't say anything, but she nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue without putting any pressure on him. It was such a perfectly her thing to do, always giving people space to figure things out at their own pace. It was one of the things he'd fallen for without even realizing it. He took another step, then another. Now he was close enough to sit beside her if he wanted to. The thought both terrified and excited him. Instead, he found himself sinking down, onto the floor in front of her, sitting cross-legged like they were kids having a serious conversation. It felt safer somehow, but also more honest. Less loaded than sitting on the bed together. I couldn't answer your question, he said, looking up at her. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted to too much. Does that make sense? She smiled then. The first real smile since this whole thing had started. Perfect sense, she said. I almost didn't ask for the same reason. The relief that washed over him was incredible, like he'd been holding his breath underwater and finally surfaced. She understood. Of course she understood. She'd probably been fighting the same battles in her own head for months. So what now? He asked. It felt strange to be the one asking questions after being speechless for so long, but also natural, like they were finally having the conversation they should have been having all along. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees so she could look at him more directly. Now we figure it out together, I guess. No more wondering what the other person is thinking. No more, almost moments that were too scared to turn into real moments. The sun was getting lower now, casting everything in that golden hour light that makes even ordinary moments feel magical. But this didn't feel ordinary at all. It felt like the most important conversation of his life, which was both thrilling and terrifying. I was so scared of ruining our friendship, he admitted. You're the best part of my days. When you text me good morning, it makes everything better. When you laugh at my terrible jokes, I feel like I could conquer the world. I didn't want to lose that. But what if instead of losing it, we could have that and more? She asked gently. What if being scared of losing something good prevented us from finding something even better? He had never thought about it that way. All these months, he'd been so focused on protecting what they had that he'd never considered what they could have. It was like being so afraid of dropping a small treasure that you never noticed the bigger treasure sitting right next to it. I think about you when I wake up, he said, the words coming easier now. And when I go to sleep, and about 100 times in between, I think about what it would be like to hold your hand while we walk, I think about what it would be like to kiss you goodnight instead of just texting it. I think about what it would be like to stop pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship. Her eyes got bright, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But instead she laughed, a sound that was part relief and part joy. I do the same thing, she said. All of it. Every single thing you just said. The space between them felt different now, still charged with possibility, but not with the same nervous energy as before. This felt more like excitement, like two people who had finally decided to stop standing at the edge of a diving board and actually jump. So, she said, and there was something playful in her voice now, something lighter. I'm still sitting on my bed. Are you going to stop me? He grinned, feeling more like himself than he had in months. No, he said, but I might join you if that's okay. She scooted over slightly, making room beside her on the bed. I was hoping you'd say that. 2 years later, he still thought about that afternoon. Not every day anymore, but often enough that the memory had become like a favorite song he never got tired of hearing. Sometimes he'd catch himself smiling about it at random moments, like when he was stuck in traffic or waiting for his coffee to brew. They were living together now in a small apartment across town. Different place, different bed, but the same afternoon light that had witnessed their first real conversation still found its way through their bedroom window each day. She still had that habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she got excited about something. He still made terrible jokes that somehow made her laugh every time. But everything was different too. Better, in ways he couldn't have imagined back when he was too scared to risk what they had. The friendship they'd been so worried about losing had actually grown stronger, not weaker. It turned out that adding love to friendship didn't subtract anything. It just made everything brighter, deeper, more real. He understood now why he'd been frozen that day. It wasn't really about being scared of her reaction or worried about ruining their friendship. It was about being scared of happiness, scared of wanting something so much that losing it would break him. He'd been protecting himself from joy because joy felt dangerous. Joy felt like something that could be taken away, but she'd taught him something important that afternoon, something he was still learning, that the risk of loss is always worth the chance of gain. That being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It just means being scared and moving forward anyway. He remembered how his heart had hammered when he'd finally stood up from the floor and moved to sit beside her on the bed. How the mattress had dipped slightly under his weight. How she'd smiled at him like he'd just accomplished something amazing, which maybe he had. How they'd sat there talking until the sun went down and the room grew dark around them. They'd talked about everything that night. All the almost moments they'd shared over the previous months. All the times they'd both wanted to say something but hadn't. All the small gestures and long looks that they'd been too afraid to acknowledge. It was like finally reading a book. They'd both been writing together without realizing it. The actual moment when they'd first kissed had been almost anticlimactic after all that buildup. It happened somewhere around midnight in the middle of a conversation about their favorite movies. She'd been explaining why she loved stories about people who take chances, and he'd been listening to her voice in the darkness. And suddenly, it just felt like the most natural thing in the world to lean over and kiss her. It wasn't fireworks or orchestras or any of the dramatic things movies had taught him to expect. It was better than that. It was like coming home. Like finding out that the thing you'd been searching for had been right there beside you all along. Looking back now, he could see how perfectly that afternoon had captured who they both were. Her courage and his caution. Her willingness to take risks and his tendency to overthink everything. But also how they balanced each other out. How her bravery had given him permission to be brave too. How his careful consideration had helped her feel safe enough to be vulnerable. She was in the kitchen now, making dinner and humming something under her breath. The same tune she'd been humming that day 2 years ago, though he doubted she remembered. He watched her move around their small kitchen with the same confidence she'd shown that afternoon. Still brave, still willing to make the first move when something needed to be said or done. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching him staring at her from the doorway. "That day," he said, because they'd long since passed the point of needing to explain which day. How different everything could have been if you hadn't been brave enough to ask that question. She turned away from the stove and looked at him with that same expression she'd worn that afternoon. Part love, part mischief, part challenge. "What if I asked you the same question now?" she said. "If I wanted to sit on our bed, would you stop me?" He laughed, the sound filling up their small apartment with warmth. "No," he said, walking over, to wrap his arms around her waist. "But I definitely wouldn't stay frozen this time." She kissed his cheek, and he could feel her smiling against his skin. "Good," she said, "because I have a lot more questions I want to ask you, and I'm done being scared of the answers. Sometimes the most important moments in your life don't feel important when they're happening. They feel ordinary, quiet, like any other afternoon." But that day had taught him to pay attention to the quiet moments, to recognize courage when he saw it, even when it came in the form of a simple question, to understand that love often looks less like grand gestures and more like someone choosing to be vulnerable with you, again and again until vulnerability becomes trust and trust becomes home.